The text came while I was peeling a hard-boiled egg over the sink. "You'll die broke. Chase just moved into your music room." For a second, I didn't feel anger, just a strange stillness like the air had stopped breathing. The shell cracked in my hand. The yolk slipped into the drain, and I stood there watching it swirl away as if it were my last piece of dignity. Somewhere outside, a church bell rang 5 times, too slow, too certain. It sounded less like time and more like a verdict. My name is Benjamin Caldwell, 52 pianist, once a professor at the Boston Conservatory. Now I rent a 1-bedroom apartment on the edge of Charleston, where the walls hum with the sound of my neighbors' televisions. The boxes stacked in the corner hold the remains of a 25-year marriage sheet music cookware, the wedding china we never used. They stand like silent jurors, reminding me that even art can't save a man from being ordinary. Laura used to say I lived too much inside melodies. She preferred the rhythm of money. When Chase Whitford, the tech billionaire who sponsored my orchestra, began sending her flowers on behalf of the arts, I pretended not to notice. Musicians are good at pretending. We've been taught to play through the pain until the piece is over. Now the performance was done. The applause had turned into paperwork stamped by a judge. I picked up the final decree and read the line that ended half my life. The paper felt colder than the keys of my Steinway. I thought about calling someone, but who? My students had moved on, my parents gone, my friends divided between hers and mine. Only Mrs. Porter, the widow next door, still knocked on my door now and then. She arrived that evening holding a casserole like a peace offering. "You've got that look," she said. "The one people wear right before life changes on them." "I think life already did," I said. She smiled faintly. "When God closes a door, Ben, he sometimes opens a vault." Then she left, her words echoing longer than her footsteps. I sat in the dim light, the smell of baked cheese filling the room, wondering what kind of vault God could possibly open for a man who'd lost everything. Then the phone buzzed again. Not a message this time, but a call. No number. Just unknown. Government caller. My first thought was scam. My second was disbelief. But then something in the air shifted, a vibration almost musical, the way a concert hall feels a second before the conductor lifts his baton. I hesitated, thumb hovering over accept. When I finally pressed it, a crisp voice said, "Mr. Caldwell, this is Colonel Reeves from the Pentagon. I need you to listen carefully. Your grandfather left something behind." And just like that, the quiet room filled with the sound of destiny tuning its strings. The voice on the line was sharp, clipped, precise, each word, like a note, struck cleanly on cold metal. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Colonel James Reeves, Pentagon Recovery Division. I'm calling about your grandfather, Major Henry Caldwell." I didn't answer at first. Rain had begun to fall against the kitchen window, tapping a rhythm that didn't belong to the room. "I think you've got the wrong person," I said finally. "My grandfather died in '89. He was a piano tuner in Raleigh." "That was his cover," Reeves replied without hesitation. Major Caldwell served in Southeast Asia in 1965, part of an operation called Echo Storm. The details were classified until last night. I laughed, the sound brittle and empty. "And now you're calling me to tell me he left a treasure in the jungle." There was no humor in his pause. Not a treasure. Compensation. Accrued over 6 decades. $160 million. The words felt ridiculous in the small apartment. My refrigerator hummed, the rain grew louder, and somewhere a siren wailed. "You expect me to believe that your grandfather left strict instructions," Reeves said. "We were to contact his next of kin on the day he loses everything he thought mattered." His phrasing, not mine. The line crackled softly as if history itself were clearing its throat. I wanted to hang up, but curiosity, that old dangerous friend, kept me there. How did you even find me? Major Caldwell provided a series of identifying markers, Reeves continued. He said you'd recognize this phrase. The voice paused, then lowered, Little Maestro. My hand froze. No one had called me that since I was 8 years old, when my grandfather sat me on the bench beside him and said, "Play what hurts Ben. That's how you tell the truth." The silence that followed was unbearable. I heard myself whisper, "What is it you want from me? To return what's owed to your family? But there are conditions. You'll need to verify your lineage in person. There's a flight booked under your name, Charleston to Washington, 6:45 a.m. tomorrow. Non-refundable." "That's impossible. He cut me off, calm but final. "Mr. Caldwell, this is not a request. If you choose not to come, the matter closes permanently." The call ended. Just like that, no goodbye, no static. Only the sound of the rain intensifying, drumming against the glass like impatient fingers. I stood in my kitchen for a long time, phone still in my hand, heartbeat syncing with the storm outside. $160 million. A dead grandfather. A secret war. Somewhere between disbelief and dread, I felt something else rising, a note of recognition, faint, but insistent, like a melody I'd once practiced as a child and thought I'd forgotten. The next morning, I packed one suitcase, my passport, and the old photograph of Henry Caldwell in his army uniform. His eyes, even in black and white, seemed to hold a question. At dawn, Charleston's streets were washed clean by the rain. As the taxi pulled away, I caught my reflection in the window, older, smaller, but somehow awake for the first time in years. I didn't know if I was flying toward redemption or ruin. Only that the music had started again, and this time I couldn't ignore the tune. The flight from Charleston to Washington was short, yet it stretched like an entire season of my life. I didn't sleep. My mind replayed Colonel Reeves's voice on an endless loop, steady, military, unshakable. $160 million. Operation Echo Storm. Your grandfather's instructions. By the time the plane touched down, the rain had followed me north, brushing against the cabin windows like an uninvited memory. Back in the apartment that night, I couldn't rest. The colonel's words had cracked something open, and now silence itself sounded different, like a rehearsal before revelation. I found myself standing before the stack of boxes Laura had labeled miscellaneous. Her handwriting, perfect and detached, stared back at me like judgment. One of the boxes was heavier than the rest. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper, was an old mahogany music box with a brass hinge and a faint engraving, HC. It played when I lifted the lid. A hesitant waltz, its melody fractured, incomplete, as if the mechanism itself carried secrets. Beneath it lay a stack of sheet music, all in my grandfather's neat, deliberate handwriting. The pieces bore curious titles: Echo Fugue, Winter Sonata, codename L65. I'd seen them once as a child during long summers in his Raleigh home. He'd play the violin late at night. No lights on, only the faint glow of a desk lamp. I remembered asking him why he never performed those songs in public. He'd smiled that slow, private smile of men who know more than they can say. Because, little maestro, he told me, music tells truths the government can't. The sheet music felt heavier than paper should. Looking closer, I noticed small marks written above certain notes, not standard dynamics or articulation. They looked patterned, short, long short, like Morse code. Beneath the manuscripts was a leather-bound journal, its spine nearly torn, the pages brittle. On the first page, written in his steady hand for Ben, when silence becomes unbearable. Something in me shifted. I thought about the timing, a call from the Pentagon on the day my marriage legally died, and now this message waiting inside a box untouched for decades. It no longer felt like coincidence. At the bottom, I found an old black and white photograph. Major Henry Caldwell, younger than I'd ever seen him, standing beside a military aircraft with two men whose faces had been carefully scratched out. Behind him, faintly visible a painted symbol, on the fuselage, a treble clef. I didn't realize my hands were trembling until the photo slipped to the floor. I called my father, Douglas Caldwell, for the first time in months. He answered on the fourth ring, his voice cautious. "Dad," I said quietly, "what was grandfather really doing in Laos?" Silence. Then a weary sigh. "I told you never to go digging into that," he said. "Some truths aren't meant to resurface." Then why did he leave the truth coded in his music? For a long time, I heard only his breath. Then soft, bitter, because he thought someone would play it someday. And in that moment I realized the past wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was waiting to be performed. The next morning, I left Charleston beneath a sky the color of pewter. Clouds pressed low against the horizon, heavy and deliberate, as if even the weather understood I was heading into something grave. I carried only one suitcase and my grandfather's worn leather journal, its presence steadier than faith itself. The ticket waiting for me at the counter read, "First Class Seat 3A, paid by the Department of Defense." I'd never flown first class before. It felt wrong somehow, like wearing a stranger's coat that fit too well. During takeoff, the hum of the engines merged with the echo of his words from the journal, "When silence becomes unbearable." Washington greeted me with drizzle and cold marble. The Pentagon, when seen in person, didn't look like the nerve center of the free world. It looked like a riddle carved into stone. Inside corridors stretched endlessly, painted in shades of bureaucracy, beige gray, and quiet fear. Colonel James Reeves met me near a security checkpoint. He was taller than I expected, the kind of man whose posture told you he'd spent a lifetime giving orders he didn't always believe in. Beside him stood a woman in a navy suit, dark hair pinned back, eyes sharp, but kind. "Mr. Caldwell Reeves said, shaking my hand. "This is Evelyn Park from the Veterans Record Division. She'll be handling identity verification." Her voice carried that calm precision unique to people who live between truth and protocol. "We've been expecting you, Mr. Caldwell. Please follow me." They led me through 3 levels of security, each one narrower, colder. Eventually, we entered a small conference room with no windows. On the table lay a sealed folder stamped Declassified Operation Echo Storm. Reeves opened it, revealing black and white photographs. A crashed aircraft deep in the jungle. A man, my grandfather, standing beside it, holding a metal case. Major Henry Caldwell was assigned to retrieve a Soviet data core from this wreck in 1965, Reeves explained. He succeeded, but the hardware was never turned in. He claimed it was destroyed. He paused, studying me. But we now know he encoded the recovered data into musical notation, specifically a composition titled Winter Fugue. I felt the room tilt slightly. He turned espionage into art. "In a sense," Evelyn said quietly. "Your grandfather was a cryptologist before he was a musician. Music was simply the safest language he knew." Reeves slid another document toward me, a storage contract dated 1971. Unit 218 Baltimore Maritime Depository. The leaseholder Henry Caldwell, paid in full through the year 2080. Whatever he hid is still there. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. "Why tell me this now?" I asked. Reeves folded his hands. Because Mr. Caldwell, others are looking for it too. Men who don't ask permission. And your name is the key on every file. Evelyn glanced at me, then her gaze steady human amid the machinery of secrets. Your grandfather didn't trust the government, she said. He trusted blood. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, tapping against the Pentagon's windows like a warning. I realized then this wasn't an inheritance. It was an unfinished song, and I was the only one left who could play it. The sleet followed me all the way to the hotel that night, hissing against the windows like static from another time. I couldn't sleep. Reeves's words kept replaying in my head. Others are looking for it too. I opened my laptop more out of restlessness than reason and typed a name that had haunted me for months: Chase Whitford. The man who had taken my wife, my home, and the life I thought I'd earned. His smile appeared on the screen, the confident kind that belongs to people who've never had to start over. Articles, fundraisers, corporate features. And then a headline buried deep in an archive from 1983. Walter Whitford defense contractor under federal inquiry. Alleged faulty aircraft components linked to lethal crashes. I stared at the grainy photo of Walter Whitford Chase's grandfather shaking hands with military officials in Laos. Behind him, a transport helicopter loomed half in shadow. A sick realization formed slowly. My grandfather's Operation Echo Storm had happened in the same year, the same region. The next morning, I called an old friend, Dennis Rowe, a former college roommate turned investigative journalist for the Washington Ledger. We hadn't spoken in over a decade, not since his exposé about corporate war profiteering had nearly ruined his career. Ben Caldwell, he said when he answered, his voice carrying equal parts surprise and fatigue. You fell off the planet. What's this about? I need to know everything you can find on Whitford Industries, especially the old contracts. Laos, 1965. There was a pause. That's ancient history, man. Why? Because my grandfather might have died keeping their secret, I said, and now his ghost just called from the Pentagon. By evening, Dennis had sent a folder. Declassified memos, export licenses, and something that made my stomach knot: a payment ledger showing Swiss account numbers identical to the ones scribbled in my grandfather's music sheets. The Whitfords had built an empire on blood and silence. And somehow the same money trail that had once been buried in war was now polished into their family fortune, into Chase's sleek tech empire, into the glass mansion Laura called our home. For the first time, anger drowned out grief. I realized Laura hadn't just left me for another man. She had walked unknowingly into a legacy of deceit older than either of us. I called her, but the number went to voicemail. Hours later, my phone rang instead. No caller ID. The voice on the line was smooth, confident venom wrapped in velvet. If you open that storage unit, Chase Whitford said you'll wish the divorce had killed you. Then the line went dead. I sat there staring at the city lights outside, their reflections trembling in the hotel window like notes on water. The world around me felt suddenly thinner, more fragile, a sheet of glass between truth and danger. I poured a drink, but it tasted of metal. My grandfather had hidden his truth inside music. The Whitfords had buried theirs in money. And now both melodies were starting to play in the same key, one that could destroy us all. The night after Chase's call, I didn't sleep. Every sound in the hotel room, the hum of the air conditioner, the shuffle of rain against the glass felt like surveillance. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. If the truth had lived this long in shadows, then it deserved to be seen in daylight. I called Evelyn Park first. She didn't seem surprised. Reeves told me you'd go looking, she said, her voice calm, but laced with something quieter. Fear or respect, I couldn't tell. Meet me at Union Station in 2 hours. Bring the journal. Dennis met us there, coffee in hand, and exhaustion written across his face. You realize he said if half of what we found is true, opening that unit is career suicide for me and possibly federal prison for you. I smiled without humor. Then it'll be a crowded cell. The drive to Baltimore was silent. Fog rolled off the harbor, swallowing the streetlights, turning the road into something dreamlike and half-forgotten. The storage facility stood at the end of a cracked asphalt road. Rows of corrugated doors painted a weary blue. Unit 218 waited near the back, its padlock dusted with decades. Evelyn keyed in a code she'd pulled from the Pentagon's archives. The door shuddered open with a groan, releasing a stale gust of air that smelled of paper and oil. Inside, a single overhead bulb flickered to life. What lay before us looked more like a museum than a storage room, stacks of weathered boxes, military-issue tape recorders, and a violin case perched on a filing cabinet. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in faded velvet, was my grandfather's violin strings, long broken, but inside the hollow body, folded pages waited. Winter Fugue, the original manuscript. I traced the ink with my thumb. The notation aligned perfectly with the Morse-like marks I'd seen earlier. Next to it, Dennis opened a metal box filled with documents stamped "Confidential correspondence between Whitford Industries and several unnamed Army officials. Payments, signatures the same Swiss accounts that had surfaced in my grandfather's coded music." Evelyn's voice was barely a whisper. "This is treason, Ben. They sold defective rotors knowing soldiers would die." I wanted to answer, but a sound outside cut me short, a footstep deliberate and heavy. Then another. The bulb above us buzzed and went dark. "Get down!" Dennis hissed. The first shot splintered the doorframe. We ducked behind the cabinet. A man's silhouette filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, steady moving with the precision of training. A second shot cracked the air. Evelyn gasped. A thin line of red bloomed across her arm. Something old and cold woke inside me. I grabbed the nearest object, the violin case, and swung it at the light switch, flooding the room with a brief glare. The intruder flinched. Dennis tackled him. Papers flew like startled birds. A struggle. A curse. Then silence. The man fled into the fog. Evelyn pressed her sleeve to the wound. "He's not done," she said. "They know what's here now." I looked around the violin, the papers, my grandfather's ghosts, and understood the weight of his silence. He'd kept the secret to protect my father. And now, standing in that dim vault, I knew I had to make the opposite choice: keep quiet and inherit a fortune, or speak and inherit the fire he'd tried to bury. We left Baltimore before sunrise, the fog trailing behind us like something alive and unwilling to let go. Evelyn's arm was bandaged, Dennis's hands still trembled on the steering wheel, and I sat in the back seat holding my grandfather's violin case as if it were a fragile relic or a loaded weapon. None of us spoke. Some silences are too full for words. By the time we reached Washington, dawn had split the sky into bruised shades of blue and rose. Dennis parked in front of the Washington Ledger building, its windows still dark except for one glowing rectangle high above. "If we publish this," he said, "there's no taking it back." "That's the point," I answered. For 2 days straight, we worked in that window-lit office, cross-checking dates, matching payment records, verifying every death linked to Whitford's defective aircraft parts. Evelyn slept on a couch, her phone constantly buzzing with messages from the Pentagon. Reeves hadn't called. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he wasn't allowed to. On the morning of the third day, Dennis hit send. The first headline went live at 6:14 a.m. The Echo Storm Files: How War Profiteers Sold American Lives for Swiss Accounts. By noon, cable news had taken it national. Whitford Industries stock plummeted 40% before trading was halted. Protesters gathered outside their headquarters in Arlington, holding photos of young soldiers whose helicopters had fallen from the sky. The reckoning spread faster than any of us imagined. Chase Whitford was arrested that same week for obstruction and tax fraud. Laura, his perfect smile, now plastered beside the words, "Federal investigation lost everything," her cars, her house, her name. 3 nights later, she appeared at my apartment door. The same woman who once told me I'd die, broke, now stood trembling in a thrift store coat. Her mascara streaked down her cheeks like faint remorse. "Ben," she whispered. I didn't know. I swear I didn't. I looked at her for a long moment. Once her voice could quiet entire rooms inside me. Now it was just another echo from a life I'd already outlived. "Neither did I said finally. "But we both do now." I closed the door. Weeks passed. Congressional hearings opened, names were read, and the Whitford empire collapsed under its own deceit. When the Pentagon settlement cleared, I transferred every cent $160 million into a trust named the Caldwell Foundation for Veterans Families. It funded scholarships, prosthetics, music therapy. My grandfather's music would finally heal what war had broken. Colonel Reeves came to see me one quiet afternoon. His uniform looked heavier than before, like it carried guilt along the seams. He placed a hand on my shoulder. "Your grandfather's silence wasn't fear," he said. "It was timing. He was waiting for someone who could play the final note." After he left, I sat at my piano, the one thing I'd kept through every loss. The keys felt cool, forgiving. I opened Winter Fugue and began to play not as a son or a survivor, but as the messenger of a truth too long unheard. Outside Washington hummed with noise and consequence. Inside the melody rose measured, resolute, and finally free. A year later, I stood on the stage of Boston Symphony Hall beneath a ceiling painted like a sky that had never known war. The seats beyond the footlights were full veterans in pressed uniforms, families clutching folded photographs, strangers who had followed a story that was never meant to be told. Somewhere among them sat Evelyn, her arm fully healed, her eyes already glistening with the kind of quiet that always comes before music. The hall felt impossibly still, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Before me, on the polished stand, lay the restored manuscript of my grandfather's final work, the Redemption Sonata. It was a piece born from secrecy, rescued from silence. Each note had been deciphered, each rest reclaimed. Somewhere between melody and Morse code lay the names of 37 soldiers whose lives had ended in the faulty helicopters Whitford Industries had sold decades ago. I rested my fingers on the keys. For a moment I could almost see him, Major Henry Caldwell, in the reflection of the piano lid. Younger than memory, older than truth. He nodded once, the way he used to, when I finally played something right. The first note hung in the air like a confession. The opening theme was slow, deliberate, a conversation between grief and grace. The adagio unfolded with the patience of someone writing a letter to the dead. In the balcony, I caught sight of a mother's face crumpling as she recognized the rhythm that spelled her son's name in code. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, her tears tracing the curve of her jaw like a hymn. Halfway through, the orchestra joined in strings swelling brass murmuring beneath them like distant thunder. Each crescendo carried a weight years in the making, every measure an act of absolution. I wasn't playing for applause. I was finishing a sentence my grandfather had begun 6 decades earlier. When the final movement arrived, I slowed. The melody thinned to a single line, a quiet pulse that felt alive. And then one last chord, soft but unyielding, a sound that seemed to breathe long after my hands lifted from the keys. The hall stayed silent. For 10 seconds, maybe 20. Then the applause rose, steady, building, unstoppable. People stood clapping not for performance, but for truth, for release. I leaned close to the microphone, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grandpa," I said. The silence finally ended. Evelyn was crying openly now. Reeves stood at the back of the hall, hat in hand, his gaze lowered like a man saying amen. The lights dimmed, leaving the stage bathed in gold. Outside, snow began to fall on Boylston Street, turning the city into a muted painting. They say every inheritance comes with a choice. Keep it or carry it forward. I had chosen the latter. Because in the end, the real inheritance isn't money. It's the courage to face the truth, even when it sings in a key no one wants to hear. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know which part touched your heart the most. Tell us where you're watching from. Our community at Domestic Tragedy reaches people all over the world. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love loss and redemption, because every tragedy deserves to be heard, and every truth deserves an audience.